John chapter 8, verses 12 through 20 is what we're going to be looking at tonight. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the story of the woman caught in adultery. And if you were here, you remember that. We spent some time talking about the evidence that's actually in existence that shows that that story was actually inserted into the Gospel of John at a later date, and that it's very likely that John didn't actually write that account of the woman himself. Now, again, I want to reiterate, there's nothing to indicate that the story itself is not a true account, but it was likely inserted into John's Gospel later. And the reason I bring it up again tonight is because that's important for us, because in light of that information, what we have to do when we're looking at John chapter 8, verses 12 through 14, we have to link it to John chapter 7, verse 52. Because that was the last verse before the story of the woman caught in adultery. And what John wrote actually goes from John 7:52, and it skips down to verse 12. Now, as I said, I think there's evidence that probably Luke wrote it, and somehow it got just mixed up somehow in the order of things and that sort of thing. But as we read it, we see the continuation of themes from chapter 7 on into chapter 8. In chapter 7, John was recording dialogue between Jesus and the Jews, especially the Jewish religious leaders that took place during the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem. You remember we talked about the Feast of Tabernacles and what that is. It was a feast where they would set up these temporary dwellings, and it was a celebration of what God had done in order to preserve the Israelites in the their days of wandering in the desert, because they were living in tents and they were traveling around. And so they would take, during this feast, it was a celebration of what God had done to preserve the people of Israel. And we talked some about last week, 2 weeks ago, about the water ceremonies that went on during the Feast of Tabernacles, and how the priests would carry water, and on the final day would carry it 7 times and pour it out on the stone, the tablet, the altar where they would make sacrifices, and that water would run down. And it was in that context that Jesus said, "I am the living water." And so understanding what was going on gives us some great context for that. And this is what's going to continue tonight. The discourse that began in chapter 7 is advanced and through the series of questions and reactions that follow the actual progress of the festival of Tabernacles from its beginning in chapter 7 verses 1 through 13 to the middle part of the feast in chapter 7 verses 14 through 36, and then on its final great day of celebration, verses 37 and 39 of chapter 7. And on this final day, Jesus has just made a tremendously important announcement about himself, where he said that I am the living water, that he's the source of the living water that the Feast of Tabernacle promises, because it's the Feast of Tabernacles, that pouring out was all a reminder. It was a ceremony to remind them of when God caused water to flow from the rock in the wilderness to give them fresh water. And so now we have this water flowing from the altar and flowing out. It was just a reminder of all of that. And so in the middle of that, he makes that announcement. And just as Jesus had done with the Sabbath in chapter 5, and just as he had done with the Passover in chapter 6, so here he has taken up the images from the Jewish celebrations, and he uses them in order to make clearer his identity as the Messiah and God's Son. Again, reminding ourselves that the Old Testament points to Jesus. It all points to Jesus. And so Jesus, when he was, for example, talking about the Passover, using that and helping, and this is a big theme of John in his gospel, that Jesus is the Passover lamb. And, we talked about how Jesus on the Last Supper that we talked about, and how Jesus broke bread and he said, "This bread is my body." Now, they've been doing this for thousands of years. And what's taking place then? That's Jesus saying, all those thousands of years, when this bread was broken, this was about me. This bread is my body, which is going to be broken for you. And so you see him taking these images and these feasts and all these things and using them to illustrate who he really is. And so with that in mind, then when we turn to chapter 8, verse 12, we have to understand Jesus is still at the Feast of Tabernacles, and he's likely still standing in the temple on the final day of the feast. And these religious motifs from that final day of the feast will continue informing what we find in chapter 8, verses 12, all the way through 59. We're only going to get to verse 20 tonight. And so, just as water was an important image in the Feast of Tabernacles, light, as we're going to discover tonight, was also very important. It played a very important role, which is precisely Jesus' theme in verse 12. Moreover, chapter 8, verses 12 through 59, it forms an important unity with chapter 9. The setting of the Feast of Tabernacles is also presupposed in chapter 9. And in verse 8-12, Jesus announces that he is the light of the world. Then in the very next chapter, he prophetically plays that out by giving light to a blind man. A man who once lived in darkness experiences divine light. And ironically, those who claim to possess the light, the Pharisees, are told that they live in darkness. So with all that said, let's begin reading in verse 12, John chapter 8, verse 12. We'll read through verse 20. And what we're going to do, I'm going to talk about what's there, help us understand the context of it. And then I'm going to, for the last part of our time tonight, I'm going to talk about what the implications of this statement, particularly this statement that Jesus makes in verse 12, in our culture, in our world, that's frankly gone mad. And what our response potentially could be. So let's read together John chapter 8, verse 12. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. The Pharisees challenged him, here you are, appearing as your own witness. Your testimony is not valid. Jesus answered, even if I testify on my own behalf, my testimony is valid, for I know where I came from and where I'm going, but you have no idea where I come from or where I'm going. You judge by human standards. I pass judgment on no one, but if I do judge, my decisions are right because I'm not alone. I stand with the Father who sent me. In your own law, it is written that the testimony of two men is valid. I am one who testifies for myself. My other witness is the Father who sent me. Then they asked him, where is your Father? Which, by the way, there might be a little bit of a dig there, because there may have been those among the leaders that know about Jesus' miraculous beginnings and all the rumors that maybe that he was an illegitimate child. Maybe not. They might not have known that. And then it goes on, you do not know me or my Father, Jesus replied. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. He spoke these words while teaching in the temple area near the place where the offerings were put. Yet no one seized him, for his time had not yet come. So in chapter 8, verse 12, we get another one of the iconic statements of Jesus. And Jesus it's really in the Gospel of John, is Jesus' second I am saying that's followed by a predicate. There are other places where he says I am without followed by anything, but here he says I am the light of the world. He gives us a definition of that. So the Feast of Tabernacles, we've talked some about it. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail. It occurred in the late autumn and celebrated the harvest of the tree and the vine. And in addition to the water ceremonies, which recalled the need for water in that dry autumn, and also remembered the miraculous giving of water by God in the wilderness, but it also provided the context for a light ceremony that was very, very popular in Jerusalem, and it was orchestrated also during the Feast of Tabernacles. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 7 sets the theological context for both ceremonies, but it really helps us particularly with the light ceremony. It says this, it will be a unique day without daytime or nighttime, a day known to the Lord. When evening comes, there will be light. So that's talking about the coming time when in the new heaven, the new earth, and the new Jerusalem, where Jesus is there, and we're told that there's no need for the sun, because God himself is the light. This is the time that it's talking about. And the imagery for this ceremony also, it pulls from that, but it also pulls from the desert stories of the water flowing from the rock, and also from the pillar of fire. And what else does fire have? It has heat, but it also has light that guided Israel for so many years. In fact, it was a pillar of fire by night. Why was that? Because you can't see smoke at night to follow it. And so it was all about the light that it was emitting. So in the Mishnah, which is just the writings in the first century Jewish leaders, that gives us a lot of historical background, that sort of thing. But in the chapter in the Mishnah on the Feast of Tabernacles, it provides really lavish descriptions of both the water and the light ceremonies, and explains that this is how they described it. They said that whoever has not seen these things has never seen a wonder in his or her life. They're talking about how spectacular this is. Now, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the water ceremony and how that set the context for Jesus' statement that he is the living water. So we're not going to talk about that tonight. Tonight, we're talking about Jesus' statement where he said, I'm the light of the world. So the light ceremonies are also set, the ceremony itself sets the context for that statement when Jesus said, I am the light of the world. So let me share with you the recorded description of the light ceremonies. This is from extra-biblical writers. These are Jewish writers from the first century who are just describing what they saw. 4 large stands, each held 4 golden bowls. These were placed in the heavily used court of the women. These 16 golden bowls, reached by ladders, were filled with oil. So there's quite large columns with these bowls on top filled with oil. So just realize it's not somebody holding a candle. It's a very big piece of equipment. And it says, it goes on, it says, and they used, this part is kind of funny to me, they used worn undergarments of the priests for wicks. Isn't that funny? I just kind of laughed when I read that. It's like, well, that's kind of funny. Here, it's every Christmas, I got to get new underwear. They burned up my old ones. I don't know. That's the way my mind thinks. But he goes on and says this, when they were lit at night, so the rabbi said, all Jerusalem was illumined. In a world, now think about this, excuse me. You go out in the city at night, there's all kinds of lights everywhere. But how many of you know you go out in the country somewhere at night and there's no lights, you can see all the stars, or if it's cloudy, it's just as dark as can be. Well, you got to understand, in Jerusalem, there was no public lighting. And so in a world that didn't have public lighting after dusk, this light shining from Jerusalem's yellow limestone walls must have just been spectacular. These 16 giant flames in the temple, in the court of the women, which is the outer court that basically everyone could go into. And while this was going on, choirs of Levites would sing during the lighting of these bowls of oil, while men of piety and good works danced in the streets carrying torches and singing hymns. So all this is going on in the Feast of Tabernacles during this time when Jesus is there. And on this final day of the Feast of Tabernacles, we're told in verse 20 that Jesus is teaching in the treasury. Well, here's the thing. The treasury is located within the court of the women. Why is that? Because they wanted both men and women to be able to give offerings. You can compare it to Mark chapter 12, verse 41. So imagine the scene. In the very court where this lighting ceremony takes place, with all of these bowls, all these massive lights, 16 bowls, with the flames going and this light, the spectacular view, in that very court where the lighting ceremony takes place, Jesus stands up and he stands beneath these bowls, these lit bowls of oil, and he says to everyone that will listen that he's not only the true light of Jerusalem, but he says, I am the light of the world. Isn't that really something when you begin to picture that in your mind? You know, one of John's favorite descriptions of Jesus in this gospel is that he is the light. John describes Jesus in this way 22 times in the book as light. The light of the world, what we have to understand, is a clear messianic title. It's a clear title indicating, it's intended to indicate the Messiah. Now, the spiritual use of light, of the metaphor of light, was common throughout the ancient world. However, Jesus' use here and in the entire scene that we have just built is thoroughly Jewish. And Jesus is referring to the countless times that God's saving work in the world is described as light. John chapter 1, verse 5 reflects this same tradition where it says, the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. When you go back to the Old Testament, God's very first creation was light. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. God's wisdom given to the world is a light that illumines his people. Hence, in Psalm 119, 105, it says, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light for my path. And over and over and over again, you can go through the Old Testament. You can see how God in his presence is described by light. And since in John's gospel, Jesus is the incarnation of God's own presence in the world, it's not surprising at all that light is used to describe the work of Christ so often. But when people standing there in that place heard Jesus make the statement, I am the light of the world, they should have remembered that Isaiah describes the Messiah as a light for the nations. Should have been a clear indicator for them exactly what he was saying. And I think probably some did catch that. Some probably did see exactly what he was saying. Isaiah 49 verse 6, this is what Isaiah said, speaking of the coming Messiah. He said, I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. So Jesus stood up and he didn't say, I am the light of all of Israel. He didn't say, I'm the light of all those who understand and keep the law. He said, I am the light of the world, pointing directly to this verse. So when Jesus stands up and calls out to the crowd, I am the light of the world, he is clearly identifying himself as the Christ, as the Messiah, as the one who fulfills God's promise to make the world right again. However, the title, the light of the world, does more than simply identify Jesus as the Messiah. It also identifies Jesus as God. We kind of touched on this a little bit. Throughout the Old Testament, God himself is called light. For instance, in Psalm 27:1, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? So add that to Jesus' claim. Now he's saying, not only is he saying I'm the Messiah, but he's saying I'm also God. Jesus is not simply a prophet with divine things to communicate, but he bears divinity within himself. He's not a man with religious insight. That would be from below, from this world, but he is God's son from above, from heaven. He's not just a messenger from God. He is God. And with this claim to be God, and this is not the first place, as we know in our study, that Jesus has made this very plain that he's claiming to be God himself in the flesh. This is just another one of the many times that we're going to see more as we continue our study in the Gospel of John. But with this claim to be God comes unique authority. We touched on that 2 weeks ago. For example, one of the unique authorities that he would have would be the ability to forgive sin. We talked about that 2 weeks ago with the woman caught in adultery. But we see this unique authority that he claims, which we see by understanding more specifically what Jesus means when he says he's the light of the world. So in chapter 6, we've touched on this. If you'll remember, it's a little bit of a theme for chapter 6, 7, and now into 8. In chapter 6, Jesus replayed the history of the nation of Israel. You remember, he fed the people miraculously with bread in the wilderness. Just like when Moses was leading the people, God fed the nation of Israel with manna. And then he crossed the sea miraculously, walked on the water, reminding them of Moses crossing the Red Sea miraculously. And then on the heels of all that, with all that Jesus had done, all that God had done through his ministry, in the same way that it happened with Moses, the crowds grumbled and complained and acted in unbelief. Same thing. Then in chapter 7, he celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles, which commemorated a very specific time in Israel's history, the time of wandering in the wilderness, being fed miraculously by God after miraculously crossing the sea. It was a time characterized, again, by grumbling and complaining and unbelief. Also in chapter 7, while celebrating the way God provided for them in the wilderness, Jesus invites thirsty people to come to him and drink in the same way that God provided water for the nation when they were thirsty. And now here in chapter 8, we see this little word. It says again in verse 12. And that word connects those words back to Jesus' statement about the water in chapter 7. So we see how he's tying them together, and we understand why now, because the Feast of Tabernacles and the ceremonies of water and light. So we should understand this metaphor in the context of Israel's wilderness wanderings. And that's very clear because that's what the Feast of Tabernacles is all about. It's remembering the time of wandering in the desert and how God kept the nation through that. After God brought the nation out of slavery in Egypt, they found themselves trapped on the banks of the Red Sea with Pharaoh closing in on them from behind. They began to doubt and to grumble and to disbelieve the word of God. And Moses told them to trust in God and watch his salvation. This is what he said in Exodus chapter 14. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. You know, I don't know if you've ever noticed that before, but when the cloud was there, it wasn't, how many remember seeing old Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, and you got that scene where the cloud's there and they're trying to get past and they're trying to dodge and the fire won't let them by. It wasn't even like that. It was like, here's this pillar of fire in between the two of them, and the Israelites are walking around in daylight, and the Egyptians are walking around like it's the middle of the night. You can't see their hand in front of their face. It's just incredible when you think about everything that was going on there. But here's the thing. From that point forward, on their journey, God leads his people through the wilderness and to the promised land with a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And all they have to do is just follow him. That's all they have to do. And if you read it, you'll discover that there are times when the cloud would move them very quickly, and other times it says they might stay in one place for months or maybe even a year before the cloud or the pillar would move them on. So, but all they had to do was when God moved, they moved. And they had to follow the light. And when Jesus calls himself the light of the world, he's not just identifying himself as God, he's also commanding them to follow him. In fact, he used those very words. He said in verse 11, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So he's telling them to follow them. And he's telling them in no uncertain terms, the only way for them to leave slavery is to submit to him. The only way to avoid walking in darkness is to follow him. The only way to make it through the desert and reach the promised land is to submit to him. And you know what? His claim of authority is no different today than it was on that first day that he said this. The only way to escape slavery to sin is to follow Jesus. The only way to know where to walk and to make it to heaven is to follow Jesus. He shows us everything else. C.S. Lewis, a great Christian writer and thinker, he wrote, and it was one of my favorite quotes of his of all time. He wrote this: I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. By claiming to be the light of the world, Jesus is saying, only by me can you see and understand everything else. Only by me can you see and understand the world. Apart from Jesus, this world is simply unknowable. The parts only make sense because of Jesus. Your life will only make sense as you submit to Jesus. And until the light of the world illuminates your world, you'll never make sense of the world. And the imagery here is very, very simple to understand. If our world didn't have the sun, not only would we not know the sun, but we wouldn't be able to see our own world to be able to understand the world. And Jesus is like the sun. We can't make sense of the world that has so much evil without Jesus. He helps us to see it. He helps us to understand it. He helps us to see how God created the universe to be. You see, that's the thing, is that our world is broken. Our creation is broken. And until we see it in the light of Jesus, we can't understand what it was supposed to be like. That's why, when you see Jesus, he teaches things, when you read through his teachings, and it seems like I've even heard it called the kingdom upside down. What Jesus is trying to say to everybody who reads that is, no, the way you understand it is wrong. I'm showing you the way it was created to be. I'm showing you the way it's supposed to work. So when he says, he was talking about leadership and authority to his disciples, and you remember they were having arguments with each other over who was going to be the greatest among them, and Jesus got a hold of that. He heard about that, and of course it was on the heels of that he washed their feet to try to explain to them, try to show to them, hey, listen, you got it all wrong. Authority in the kingdom is not about who gets to be the greatest. Authority in the kingdom is about who gets to serve everybody else. And that's his way of saying this is how it was meant to be. It's our brokenness, it's our humanity that has caused authority to become something that is abused. Anyway, that's just one example of that. But in Jesus' light, we can embrace the reality that the world is broken because of sin, but we can do that with hope, for Jesus has promised to fix it. And our hope is not a fool's hope. It's not a fool's dream. It's rooted in the reality of the resurrection. Jesus already defeated death, so we have confidence that he will one day banish death forever. Jesus is the light of the world, and only by following him can we see. Now, Jesus' self-reference as light, guiding people through darkness, as a pillar of light guided the Israelites in the desert, that self-reference, that claim, is quickly challenged by the Pharisees in verses 13 through 19. The Pharisees' argument in verse 13 echoes what occurred during Jesus' last visit to Jerusalem in chapter 5. Some of you may remember some of that, but it was in that moment when he referred to the legal qualifications of judicial witnesses by saying, Jesus said, if I testify about myself, my testimony is not valid. And we talked some about the fact that Jewish law required more than one witness to validate any testimony. And Jesus knows this law. He understands that. Unfortunately, his opponents have forgotten that in the earlier Jerusalem debate in chapter 5, Jesus already showed them that there were ample witnesses verifying his claim. He mentioned John the Baptist as one of the witnesses. He mentioned his miraculous works as a witness. He mentioned the Father as a witness. And he mentioned even the Scriptures as a witness. And now Jesus must repeat again that his Father is a second witness. However, something important now has changed. Something has been added because here's the thing. Jesus would, without a doubt, he would not say that whenever he speaks alone, his words are invalid. He knows who he is. He has the authority to say something, and just because he doesn't have another human being backing him up doesn't mean that it's invalid. As if his words must be weighed by the double witness judicial rule. think about it like this, because he says on there that you judge by human standards. Well, who needed more than one witness? Humans did. God doesn't need another witness, right? He has the authority to say what is true, and when he says it, it is right, it is true. He doesn't need another witness. And Jesus is, in essence, he's saying the same thing here. He's saying, you know what, the Father's my witness, but my words are true. And so he doesn't judge in the same manner according to the flesh or by human standards that the Pharisees did. And Jesus' judgment is true. His words are true, not because of their inherent persuasiveness, but because of their origins. And this is the new unexpected authority behind Jesus' testimony. Jesus comes from the Father. He does not speak on his own authority, but he is echoing what the Father has told him to say. So, the problem that the Pharisees were having here, the root problem with Jesus' opponents, is that they don't know the Father. The words are coming from the Father. If they knew the Father, they'd recognize the voice. But since they don't know God, even though they claim to, even though they would get into a fight with you if you said you don't know God, they would say, what are you talking about? We've studied God all our lives. But the root problem is they don't know the Father. And they are incapable of having true spiritual discernment because they don't know the source of all spirituality, which is God himself. And this criticism is the same one that we heard in chapter 5, verse 42 during Jesus' last visit to the temple. Without a deep knowledge of God and his love, it's impossible to recognize his Son. How many of you have you ever seen somebody, a father and a son, and you looked at the two of them and you said to yourself, well, there's no denying that's his son, because you looked at him and they were so much alike. You were like, even if you didn't see them together, you saw the son, and later you're like, I know whose child that is. I remember my younger brother Jimmy. He's a cousin by blood, but we adopted him many years ago. He's my brother. But for a long time we didn't know where he was. No, I'm sorry. Later in life, we had lost contact with him. And then I went to one of my other nephew's field days. We happened to be there on vacation. We went to this field day, and there in the crowd was a young man. And I looked at him, and I thought, I didn't even know who he was, but I thought, that has to be Jimmy's son. Because he looked just like him. Here's what Jesus is saying. If you knew the Father, you would see I look just like him. If you knew him, you would know me. That's the essence of what he's saying. And since you don't know him, you can't possibly identify me as his son. And in this statement, Jesus declared himself to be the means of knowing God personally, because he said, listen, if you know me, you know the Father. Because we are the same. We are exactly alike. And he's the perfect representation of the Father. Well, this interchange takes place in the temple area near the place where the offerings were put, called the treasury in some translations. And that's within the court of the women. And in there, by the way, there were 13 money chests. They were all built in the shape of a shofar. You know what a shofar is? It's just a ram's horn. And they're built in the shape of that. And each one of them had some sort of sign on there indicating how the money that was put in that particular chest was going to be spent. In fact, you remember in Mark chapter 12, you remember the story of the woman with the small copper coins, and Jesus, apparently he would go there often and watch people giving their offerings, because, by the way, you can tell a lot about a person's heart by what they do with their money. And you remember she deposits these 2 copper coins, and And you remember Jesus talking about how the Pharisees like to sound the trumpets when they give their offerings? Well, it wasn't that they were walking through there blowing their horn. It's that these things were shaped like horns. And so they would make sure that made lots of noise and drew lots of attention to themselves when they're putting their big offering in. It was all, and that was the point of Jesus saying he's trying to draw attention to themselves. But this is where it took place. And the treasury, what we know historically, was very close to the hall where the Sanhedrin met. And John goes on to remark that Jesus is not seized by the Pharisees, even though they were right there. And the reason is because Jesus' hour had not yet come. And that statement tells us a couple of things. One, it tells us and anticipates the fact that Jesus' hour would eventually come. Because he said his hour had not yet come. And the hour would come when those who had been pursuing him would finally get their hands on him. But it also tells us the timing of that was under God's control, not under man's control. So that's the story and the background. What I want to do is I want to spend the next few minutes before we go home and close out tonight's Bible study and talking about how this relates and help you understand our culture a little bit. Because especially if you're a little bit older, I'm telling you, you look at our culture, and if you don't understand what has taken place, I know you're completely baffled, and it's beyond your comprehension how people could believe some of the things they believe. So I'm going to give you a little insight into some of that and talk about what verses like this is one verse, means and how what we can do in response to that. So I want to go back to the statement that we've spent our time talking about in chapter 8, verse 12, where Jesus said, I am the light of the world. And I want you to notice something there, because this is the part that gets stuck in the craw, so to speak, of our culture. Jesus said he is the light of the world. He did not say he was a light, one among many, but the light, the one and only source of truth. And this is a stumbling block in our postmodern world. And if you don't know some of these terms, modernism, postmodernism, that's okay. You don't have to know these things. But most of us in this room grew up in the age of modernism. And we're going to talk about the difference between the two a little bit. But we now live in an age where truth is believed to be relative and personal, not objective and universal. I think you've seen this a lot. You hear people say things like, and we'll mention this again in a minute. You hear people say things like, well, you speak your truth. This is why they say it, because they're living in a postmodern mindset. And maybe you'll understand a little bit. I can't, and believe me, you can read whole volumes on this subject. And so I can't give you a full understanding, but maybe I can give you a little bit of an idea of where we are and how maybe we can respond to that. But today, people pick what they believe based on how it makes them feel, not on the merits of evidence. If it feels good to them, if it makes them feel good, then they believe it. If they don't like the way it feels, then they'll reject it. How many of you have ever experienced truth that made you uncomfortable? So you know what? So now we've already got a problem there, right? And so what we have now is people who have chosen various parts of different belief systems, and they've incorporated them all together in their own set of beliefs, often in their own set of beliefs, holding beliefs that are in direct opposition to each other, and they have no problem with that. They don't have a problem with that. People say things like, you speak your truth and I'll speak mine. And they believe that truth is a personal judgment, not a universal fact. And when someone says, by the way, that there is no universal truth, it's interesting, because to say that, they are claiming a universal truth. It's absolutely philosophically indefensible, because if objective universal truth does not exist, then one could not make that claim, because in so doing, you are putting forth a truth that must apply to everyone. Therefore, it's a universal truth. Now, for most of us in the room, raised in the age of modernism, what that meant was we were trained growing up to discover truth, right? To read a book and say, what is the truth the author is conveying? Where is the evidence? And for us, truth was out there to be discovered. Modernism said that there is truth out there and that man's reasoning, through man's reasoning, he can discover all truth. Now, that's not entirely biblical, by the way, because there's plenty of truths in this world, spiritual truths in particular, that cannot be discovered by man's reasoning or man's ability to think. But that's the mindset of modernism. Postmodernism says that there is no objective truth, that it's all relative, that it's all based on culture, it's all things that you've been taught. Postmodernism says that truth is not out there to be discovered, but truth is out there to be created. And whatever you think is true is just as true as whatever the author of the book you're reading was writing. That your belief is just as true as his, regardless of the fact that he or she may have evidence. And it says that all truth is personal. And this means that whatever you perceive to be true is just as true as whatever actually happened. I'm going to go way back, maybe get myself in trouble. This is why a sitting president can stand in front or sit in front of a panel and say, I did not have sex with that woman. Yeah, it depends on what your definition of is. These things. Why you can do that? Because whatever you want to perceive to be truth, you can make it true. That's the whole mindset of it. In other words, all truth is just simply translation. You translate to yourself and it's just as true as whatever anybody else says. And choice becomes the issue. It doesn't matter what you choose. The key is your choice, because whatever you choose is just as true as whatever anyone else chooses. So you choose whatever is right or wrong for you. But don't you dare impose your values on me. That's the mindset. Give me the freedom to decide what is right and wrong, and I'll live my life according to that. It's all based on subjective feelings. This is what I like. This is what makes me feel good. This is what I choose to believe. Now, in light of that, the number one accusation why Christianity is false among those with a postmodern mindset, ironically, is they say it's false because it claims to be true and says that all other claims are false. So if a belief system says this is truth, what you're saying is false, you are rejected. You are then called, guess what the word is? Intolerant. That's the buzzword. That's the key word. And the claim is that Christianity is intolerant. Now, to arrive at that conclusion, the postmodernist has changed the meaning of the word tolerant, because tolerance, by Webster's dictionary, by the dictionary definition, is to bear or put up with something not especially liked. That's what it means to tolerate something. And by that definition, Christianity is extremely tolerant. Because you don't see Christian-led nations that are calling for the extermination of other people in the nation who hold different beliefs. Now, you do see that in some other belief systems. Now, the truth is, now we want to tell them the truth about Jesus, and we want to change the worldview. We want to reach all of those involved in these man-made religious systems with the gospel. And ultimately, we would love to eliminate every one of those other false religions. But not by force. By convincing them, showing them the truth, and letting them come to Christ. However, the dictionary of definition of tolerance is not what is used in the world today. When you hear somebody say that someone's being intolerant, they don't mean you're not putting up with things that you don't especially like. The postmodernist mindset uses a completely different definition of tolerance. This is what they say. This is the creed. This is what underlies so much of what's particularly in left-wing ideology. They say this: all values, beliefs, lifestyles, and claims to truth are equal. The Christian cannot say that. And by that definition, you and I have now become, instead of the most tolerant people on earth, we are now the most intolerant people on earth. Because we cannot say that all values, beliefs, lifestyles, and claims to truth are equal. Because to say that would be to say that somebody who believes in some, cult that worships, there's in India, you can go someplace and you can go to this temple where they worship monkeys. And they have golden monkeys in there. And you'd have to say, well, that person is just as correct as me when I worship the God of all creation. Which, by the way, if you're choosing a false god, surely you can do better than a monkey. I've been to the zoo. I know what they throw, But right now, the truth of what you say is not even an issue. But what right do you have to say it? Isn't that the argument made by pro-abortionists when they say that men should have no right to say anything regarding whether a woman can have an abortion or not? What right do you have to speak your truth? Well, the problem is life is sacred, and it is human life. Therefore, all humans have a right to proclaim the truth that child is sacred and should not be killed regardless of that person's gender. But this is the world we live in. And Jesus making the statement, I am the light of the world. There is no other way. There is no other source of light. There is no other source of life. There's no other way to find your way to the Father. When he makes those statements, that flies in the face and runs against the grain of everything that our culture has bought into. Now, the good news is there's been signs that maybe there's been some rejection of some of that with some people in some generations. But by and large, that's the culture in which we live. So here's the question. What do we do? If we know Jesus is the light of the world, if we know that he is the way, the truth, the life, if we know these things, how do we approach this? Because if you just go to somebody and start telling them, hey, listen, Jesus is the only way, that's just the truth, you got to accept it. Well, if they have this mindset, they're not going to listen to anything you say because you're intolerant. Why should I listen to you? By the way, it's always funny to me, the ones that cry for tolerance, it's amazing how intolerant they are to somebody who does actually claim truth. So the question is, put it another way, how do we become plausible that we might become credible? Another way to say it is, how can we earn the right to be heard? 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, Paul writes this. But we were gentle among you, like a mother caring for her little children. We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you had become so dear to us. The way they won that generation in Paul's day was not only by imparting the gospel, not only by proclaiming truth. Now they did that, but it was also with their own lives, their whole life. We must not only impart the truth of the gospel, but we also have to sow our lives into the lives of people to earn the right to be heard. 80% of the young people who are becoming Christians today are doing so not because they're convinced it is true, but because it's the best thing to come along so far. And if we don't lead them into the truth of the Word of God, they will eventually leave as soon as something that seems better comes along. If that's their only motivation to be following Christ is that, well, seems like the best thing I've found. No, we have to teach them. We have to find ways to lead them into truth because it's in the truth that they find the foundation for the rest of their lives. So, how do we do this? What are the tools that we have at our disposal? How do we invest our lives to make this happen? Well, the number one thing, the first thing is to develop community. It comes down to this. We must love one another. And particularly, I'm talking about in the church. Somebody once said, there's nothing like the church when the church is working right. And when the church of Jesus Christ is working properly, there is no place in the world that you can get such a crazy mixture of people and age groups and backgrounds and have them come together as a family. You know what the closest place the world has to it is? A bar. It really is. It's the closest. But even that is built on something that, the next day you don't even remember half of what they did. But to love one another, the church that is able to create a community of love will be a church that is effective. And the spiritual health of the church is becoming a foundation for evangelism. What did Jesus say? By this will all men know you are my disciples, that you have what? Love, but it goes on. Love for one another. It's not just our love for the lost. He's saying when other people see how different people from different backgrounds and different generations and different everything, when they come together and they genuinely love each other, the world looks at that and says, that is different. That's weird, but I like it. I remember in Reno, there was I don't have time to go into all the details of the story, but there was a series of events that happened, and there were a group of people who started coming into our church from a subculture in Reno. I mean, it was a rough subculture. I mean, it was some of these people, if I didn't know them, I'd have been scared of them, frankly. And they had tattoos in places I didn't even have places. It was just. But I remember the first Sunday, some of them said, I'm going to come to church this Sunday. And one day I'll tell you the whole story, because it's just this amazing grace-filled thing that God did in Reno. But first day, someone was going to come to church. And, I had, in the church there were different generations, but there were some in there, they were, excuse me, including the founding pastor of the church and his wife were still part of the church. We're talking old-time Pentecostal. Straight-laced, and I thought, oh my goodness, what's going to happen, Lord? What's going to happen? And they came in and sat down, looking, pretty rough. And you know who the first person who was that went down and sat next to them and sat with them the whole service? It was that old Pentecostal lady. Where does that happen? Only in the church. It's that love for one another. And they will know there's something different. They will know. Here's the thing. And I'm not saying this is a good thing, but we have to understand where people are. Many young people today are not asking if Christianity is true. They're asking, does it work? Now, that's not necessarily a good thing, because it's not all about experience. But understanding that's where they're coming from, we have to live our lives in a way that they can see it makes a difference in us. Because then as they see us, and they see us loving one another from all these different backgrounds and generations and different, all kinds of stuff behind us, and they see us loving one another, that's one of the indicators. They look at us and they say, you know what? That seems to really work there. Did you know that some studies show that 70% of teenagers are depressed? This is one of the most hurting generations of teenagers in history. And the church that creates a community of love will be attractive to that generation. Let me move on. The second tool in our disposal, we can develop community, but the second one, it's very important, is compassion. Psalm 146 verses 5 through 9 says, "Blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God, the maker of heaven and earth, the sea and everything in them, the Lord who remains faithful forever. He upholds the cause of the oppressed and gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets prisoners free. The Lord gives sight to the blind. The Lord lifts up those that are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the alien and sustains the fatherless and the widow. And he frustrates the ways of the wicked." The things that are going to attract this generation are ministries like Convoy of Hope, ministries of compassion. When, like, for example, this church giving out turkeys at Thanksgiving, it's those kind of things that really show Christian compassion. And as we do that, it becomes a tool where they look at our lives and they say, you know what? It actually makes a difference in what they're doing. Compassion will be one of the greatest things we have going for us in reaching people for Christ. And God has called us to embrace people, not to condemn people. He's called us not to judge, but He's called us to love. Now, does that mean that we don't ever call out truth or speak? No, because that's not what judging is. Judging is not if you do something that is incorrect and I tell you that's wrong, that's not judging, that's correction. There's a big difference between the two. Judging would be you do something wrong and I say, oh, you're just a really rotten person. See, there's a difference. One is saying, no, that's not the right way to do it. The other is saying, you're a bad person for doing it. That's judging. We have to remember, and this is really important, especially this is something we needed to remember during this whole election cycle, and we got to remember this. America is not a battlefield for us. It's a mission field. Yes. Here's the third thing, and I'm going to run out of time. But our marriages and our families are huge tools. A survey of 15 to 17-year-olds showed that their number one desire in life is a happy home life. Another study showed 72% said their greatest desire in life is to have a happy marriage. Another study of 13 to 19-year-olds said that 80% of the American dream to them was a happy home life. You notice none of them had anything to do with money or big houses or fancy cars. We understand where this is coming from. We have a generation among us that has been devastated by divorce. You know, when you and I were children, parents would stay together for the sake of the kids. Now we live in an age where, well, I deserve to be happy. And it doesn't matter what happens to the kids. Oh, they'll be fine. The kids are tough. Their kids are resilient. They'll be fine. Well, the kids aren't fine. 70% of them are depressed. What that means is, again, if they're not asking if it's truth, but they're asking if it works, one of the areas they're going to be looking to is to say, how does it affect their marriage? How does it affect their home life? Josh McDowell, great apologist, youth speaker for many years, he was speaking to a large group of people in Canada. And as he began his talk, he said to them that he wanted to just share his heart with them as a dad. And during his talk, he made statements like, to those young people, he'd say things like, I wish you were my son, or I wish you were my daughter. And what happened at the end of that startled him, because these young people rushed the stage shouting to him, I want to be your son. I want to be your daughter. And they were all just crying, and he was just shocked. One girl said to him afterwards, she said, I'm 16 years old, and for the first time tonight, I felt like there's been a father who loved me. You know what? There are lots of kids like that. And by serving as a spiritual mom or a dad, you can really make a difference. And what opens the door is your relationship with your children and with your spouse. And if you're a grandparent, maybe your relationship with your grandchildren becomes one of the most powerful tools that we have in reaching this generation and imparting our lives to them. I'm going to close by telling a story, another Josh McDowell story that I heard him tell many years ago. It was a story of a time in his life when he was extremely busy. And of course, somebody like Josh McDowell, national figure, put out tons of books and, had speaking engagements everywhere all the time. He was always very busy. And this particular time in his life, he was writing one of his books and he was facing this looming deadline. And as he was in his study working on his book, his 2-year-old son came in to see him and wanted to crawl up on his lap and spend some time with his daddy. And Josh, like most of us probably would, he looked at his son. He said, "Son, Daddy's really busy right now. Daddy's really busy." And he promised the little boy that he'd spend some time with him later. At that, the little boy's head just drooped and his shoulders slumped and he slowly retreated out of the room. Well, after a couple seconds, Josh's wife came and just stood silently in the doorway, their hands on her hips, in the way that every man with a lick of common sense fears. And he knew she was upset, and he eventually said, "What's up, sweetheart?" And Josh's wife stood there in the doorway and said to him, "Josh, I know you're busy. I know you have a deadline. I know you have to prepare for your next speaking engagement." And then she looked him straight in the eye and she said, "Josh, the truth is, you're always going to have a deadline. You're always going to have another book you're working on. You're always going to have another speaking engagement for which you must prepare. But you won't always have a 2-year-old son who wants to sit on your lap and talk with you." With that, she turned away and walked off. And he immediately felt the conviction of the Holy Spirit. And he called his son back into his study, and he took all the time his son wanted with him to be together. And now fast forward many years. His son was now 20 years old and was the starting point guard at a small Christian college that he was going to. And Josh's schedule, as usual, was always very busy, but whenever he could fit it in, he would arrange to fly into the town where the college was on a game day so he could watch his son play. Well, on one particular trip that he was on, they had an unexpected schedule change, and so Josh decided to change his flight schedule, and he flew in to surprise his son and to watch his son play in a basketball game, with his son not knowing he was coming this time. Well, when Josh arrived at the gym, the varsity women's game was already in full swing, and as it happens, I can remember this back in my Bible college days, the women's team was out there on the court playing, and the men's varsity team was up in the bleacher watching them and cheering them on. And so this is what was happening, and the guys were just sitting in the bleachers waiting their turn on the court, and his son was there watching the game. And when Josh entered the door, of course, he's very well known, and certainly very well known on the small Christian college campus. And when he came in the door, many students in the crowd saw him, and they immediately recognized him. And they knew that his son was the point guard on the team, and so they immediately looked from him to his son, and everyone realized right away that his son hadn't seen Josh come in the doors. He didn't know he was there yet. So Josh made his way into the main part of the gym and started walking in front of the bleachers, making his way toward his son. Eventually his son, looked over and saw his dad making his way toward him, and he leapfrogged over, some other players and students to get down on the main floor of the gym. And Josh continued walking toward his son, and now his son was on the floor walking toward him, and they were going to meet at center court. There's about where everybody was, and now by this time, nobody in the crowd is even watching the women's basketball game, because they're all just watching Josh and his son make their way toward each other. They'd look at Josh and then look at his son, and look at Josh, look at his son, and it was like they were watching a tennis match. When Josh and his son finally reached each other at mid-court, right behind the scorer's table, Josh's son practically leaped into his daddy's arms, and they embraced in an emotional hug, and they gave each other a kiss. And at that moment, just as they embraced one another, suddenly the entire crowd leaped to their feet and gave them a standing ovation. And the women's team was all confused because nothing had happened on the court. They're like, what's going on here? But nobody was watching the game. And they were watching a father and a son race toward each other and embrace in a hug. They were watching, saying, I wish I could meet my dad there. Later that night, as Josh was sitting on his plane preparing to go to his next destination, he remembered his attention was directed back to that night so many years earlier when he took time to engage with his 2-year-old son. As he thought about it, he realized that if he had not met his son in the study when he was 2, his son would not have met him at half court when he was 20. The truth was that every one of those students would have loved to have met their father at half court. But here's the thing. Many young people in our community don't have that dad that's going to meet him at half court. But as you love your family and you draw other kids, because they have friends. When our girls would bring friends over, we would just tell them, hey, you're one of ours now. We would treat them just like our own kids. And as you do that, you're beginning to show them that faith in Jesus Christ is more than just a creed. It's more than just a belief system, but it is something that changes a human being down to his or her very core and shapes everything about who they are and what they do, including the way they live their lives. And that's the moment where those young people begin to say, maybe that's for me. Now, you're not going to reach those young people by just going to them and pointing your finger at their face and saying, hey, you better listen to me. I got the truth. I'm going to tell you the truth. And everything you could say could be exactly, perfectly right. But you have to understand the culture in which you live in order to be able to earn the right to be heard. That's what it's all about. To reach this generation, we need to teach the truth, yes. But we also need to live that truth. And we need to impart the truth with our lives, not just our words. Now, it can't be either or. Don't fall into the trap where people say, well, I'm just going to live the truth and let people see it. No, because if you don't speak the truth, they don't know what's different. They just know there's something different about you, but they don't know why. And if you just speak the truth and you don't live it out, then they're like, well, it's just a bunch of words to them. It doesn't change the way they live. But when you speak the truth and you live the truth, you become then, in a sense, a little incarnation of Christ. You can become a little picture or a reflection of who He is. Now, don't go reporting me for heresy. I'm not saying that you are literally an incarnation of Christ. But you become to them, you become Jesus to them in a sense. You become the hands of God reaching out to them. You become the mouthpiece of God speaking into their lives. And we need to impart our lives to them as we live the truth and teach the truth through community, through our marriages, through our children, through a relationship with our grandchildren. And maybe if you don't have children or grandchildren, you know what? There are still plenty of young people that you could adopt as a spiritual father. You can't make it happen, but you can ask God to open those doors. The way we live our lives allows the truth of the light of the world to shine clearly through us. And in that light, this generation will find truth and purpose and joy and peace and an abundant life in Christ. Everything they're looking for, they'll find it in Him. Would you bow your head and let's pray together. Father, as we come into your presence, we thank you, Jesus, that we know you are the light of the world. And Lord, we live in that light and we want to grow and live in that light all the more. But Father, we also know that we live in a world that is so confused and they have been lied to by so many teachers and philosophical leaders and and they've been lied to in so many ways, in so many different areas. And God, we know that in order for them to hear and understand the truth, they're going to have to not just hear it from our mouths, but see it lived out. And so, God, I pray you would help us to be consistent. Now, Lord, I know we're not going to be perfect, but even when we fail, Lord God, that we will be consistent in repenting and before you and before other people. But God, I pray that you'd help us to invest our lives in the lives of people, especially this next generation, Lord, because there's so many that are hurting and they're looking for answers and they've given up on so many other things. God, I pray that they will see the truth of the gospel lived out in our lives, and that as they hear the truth of the gospel and see it in our lives, that you would just stir a hunger in their hearts and you would give us the opportunity to lead them to the truth of Jesus. Thank you for what you're going to do. We believe you for it. In the strong name of Jesus, amen.